Supreme Court looked at law and looked at liberty through the prism of the Declaration and understood that the fundamental right of a parent to control and direct the upbringing of their child was one of those fundamental liberties that we're going to measure your laws by. And when they measured that law against that sacred, that inalienable right that you all have, and that you all knew you had the minute you held your little baby in your arm, the Supreme Court told you what you already knew. That this is an unchanging, a sacred liberty, one of constitutional import, that government don't dare tread. Because if you do, we will strike it down. Now let me show you a little bit. I brought a couple of props here. Let me show you how it's supposed to work. And I sure wish we had a couple of members of the Senate Judiciary or House Judiciary Committee, here today, because the very first thing I did after I prayed, when I took the oath of office on the bench, is I went and got this Constitution, and I read it from the beginning to the end. Because under this Constitution, nobody in this building, or in any courthouse, or in the White House is allowed to act until they go to this Constitution first. They must go to the Constitution before they act. And so think of this as a power plug. They've got no power to act unless they can specifically go to the Constitution, find some provision in the Constitution that authorizes them to act, plug into that power source, then they may act. Now, just because they act, they got to make sure that they don't act inconsistently with one of those inalienable sacred rights. So if they act in such a way that interferes with your right to free speech, or your right to the free exercise of religious conscience, or your fundamental right of a parent to control the upbringing of your child, it's like there is a circuit breaker that cuts off that law, and the government has ceased having any authority or any power to act. And that is what happened when Oregon, the state government, attempted to interfere with your fundamental right as a parent to control the upbringing of your child. Brothers and sisters, we live in a different time. We now have he mentioned that I teach in law school. I'm telling you, I step into the lion's den every day. And if I'm fortunate, it's the furnace, and I have a couple other brothers and sisters there with me, like, Meshach and Abednego, as opposed to Daniel being by himself. But most of the time, I feel like I'm going into the lion's den. So it's nice to be here, my friends. What 99% of professors in this country that teach constitutional law teach anymore, they don't even bring up any of the things I just brought up. And I'm estimating, but I'm guessing about half the members of the federal judiciary no longer believe those self-evident truths. There's still a bunch that do. But there's at least, after reading the dissent in the Second Amendment case that just came down, that we just won, after reading the four dissenters, though, you ought to be shaking in your boots, because you've got four members of the Supreme Court that have redefined judicial activism to no longer mean we can make up a right like abortion or euthanasia or anything we want to make up. They've redefined the rule of law to also say, even if we've got a listed Bill of Rights, a listed freedom, we can say it doesn't exist. Last time I looked, the only folks that we elected work in that building. Now, they don't sit up on a bench. That is a scary thought. And let me tell you what has happened with regard to your fundamental right as a parent to control the upbringing of your child. There is no longer a majority of the Supreme Court that will recognize that as a fundamental, inalienable, sacred right. Now let me tell you what that means. Usually, when Congress plugs into a power source and they pass a law, and then somebody like you or I say, wait a minute, that law, you may have had a legitimate power source under the Commerce Power or someplace, or the Postal Power, or someplace authorizing you to enact a law. But you didn't look at the First Amendment. Or you didn't look at the rest of the Constitution, and you are interfering with my freedom. You're substantially interfering with my freedom. The way it used to work, folks, the way it used to work is that the Supreme Court would then take that law, and when they would not just look at that law with an eyeball like mine that isn't seeing very well because I need glasses. In fact, I don't have my glasses with me. Can I borrow somebody else's glasses? Those are mine right there. Thank you, sir. What the Supreme Court does is they don't just eyeball the law, they bring out their specs. And they put it on, and they give it what the Supreme Court calls strict scrutiny. And they look at that law very, very closely if it is interfering with one of our fundamental rights. And so it becomes important that whatever right we're talking about, whether it's fundamental or not, because if it's fundamental, the Supreme Court puts on its glasses and looks at it very closely, and then it says to government, you must, government, have a very, very compelling reason of the highest order before you dare interfere with one of these inalienable rights. Not only must you have a very compelling reason of the highest order, you must be using in your law the least restrictive means possible to accomplish this very compelling reason of the highest order. How many laws do you think survive that kind of scrutiny? None. Very few, which is why when Oregon passed that law, it went down in flames. Now, there is no longer a majority on the court willing to say that your right to direct the upbringing of your child is a fundamental right. So this pair of glasses, never going to come out. Never going to come out. And the court's not going to give it strict scrutiny next time government starts passing laws that interfere with your right to raise your child. Now let me tell you about the law that's coming. It's that Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's a fancy name for a treaty. Again, every nation in the world, except for the United States, and I think maybe one other nation that's like a developing country that doesn't even have a government probably at this point, Somalia, I think it is. The reason the United States has not are very, very good. Number one, it takes the right of a parent to control the upbringing of the child and says that a child has an equal right, has a right to make decisions for themselves, and the government must enforce those rights in the best interest of the child. Now, I'm not making this stuff up, folks. It sounds ludicrous. It sounds like we're living in a surreal world. Now, I don't have to, I could probably give you a lot of hypotheticals of what might happen, but I don't have to do that because every nation in the world has already implemented it. And let me tell you the type of things that are happening. They are chastising nations that aren't raising taxes and taking money from defense and raising taxes to promote their new laws that are telling them that you must not spank your child. And so England, for example, has been chastised by this UN committee that's saying that you're not spending enough money to raise awareness among your citizens to let them know that corporal punishment is not allowed. And yes, you're spending too much money on defense. You should be taking some of that to spend for raising this awareness. Australia, Denmark, Austria, the UK, not spending enough tax dollars on social welfare for children.